Hello, YPs, and welcome back to another month of our podcast. This month, April, we are talking about the environment. My name is Marissa Gaston. I am the director of the WPC Young Professionals, which is the program of the Washington Policy Center that stewards our 18 to 39-year-old members, strives to educate, engage, and empower them to create the next generation of free market leaders in Washington State. Today, I'm thrilled to have with me the chairman of our YP Advisory Board, Carson Vollen, also the founder of TimberRise, and as well as Hannah Downey, who is the policy director at PERC, which is the Property and Environment Research Center. Today, we're going to be talking about, as I said, environment, but also kind of broadly the role of governments and markets in the environmental policymaking space. We're going to try to ground that discussion in forests. So first, I'm going to kick it over to my two guests to talk a little bit about themselves, talk about their background. Hannah, do you want to jump in and get started?
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much, Marissa and Washington Policy Center YP Group for letting me come and talk with you guys today. This is an issue that is so near and dear to my heart. So I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all. As Marissa mentioned earlier, I'm Hannah Downey. I'm the policy director at PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center. We are a 40-year-old research institute located in Bozeman, Montana, and we are dedicated to free market environmentalism. We're the home of free market environmentalism. And essentially what that means is we do research on how markets and property rights can improve environmental quality. We work on issues largely related to land, water, and wildlife. And essentially our goal is to improve conservation without just relying on bigger or more government. So today we'll get into a lot of kind of what that actually means and what some of the examples of that are. But I really came to the work in the environmental policy space just because I kind of grew up really passionate about the environment. I actually wanted to be an environmental lawyer when I started college, and then realized that I actually did not want to do that at all, but did want to continue to work in the environmental policy space. I was lucky to grow up hiking and skiing and exploring the wilderness areas of Montana with my family. I worked on a cattle ranch here in Montana that was privately owned, but we had Forest Service tracks, and I was a backpacking guide in college, and have been lucky enough to continue to explore the outdoors, not only professionally, but in my personal life too. And it's really wonderful to have the chance to explore how those two come together and look to advance conservation outcomes.
It's awesome. And I'll pass it over to Carson, talk a little bit about his background.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And really a pleasure to be here, and always a pleasure to do anything Washington Policy Center focused. Hannah, it's great to be on the call with you today as well. My name is Carson Vollen, and as Marissa mentioned, currently the YP Young Professionals Advisory Board Chair, and then also run a company called TimberRise based in Seattle, Washington. And it's a real estate development company focusing primarily on commercial projects, and really leverages this innovation within the construction industry that's centered around a new material, or relatively new to North America, called mass timber. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it a little bit more, but pretty exciting. It's a substitute to concrete and steel. So the intent behind it is to capture the carbon embodied in the wood itself, so in the physical structure of the building, versus concrete and steel are relatively large, 11 to 13% of total carbon emissions globally every year. So there's an environmental opportunity there. Also, the buildings are beautiful in their own right. So you get the natural aesthetic of wood. You get the ability to have people live and work around natural materials versus much colder concrete and steel. So the premise of the company is to narrow the gap between the built environment and the natural world. And I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of benefits, but one of the ones I like the most, and is pretty germane to this conversation, is that people living and working around natural materials creates an inherent value that they prescribe to natural places, and that's really important. And so when you narrow that gap, and cities feel closer to wild places, they feel closer to the forest, people then have a heightened awareness of the need to protect them and to value those places. And so So I think that's really inspiring and just kind of one piece of the overall inspiring work that we do at TimberRise. So thank you.
Thank you both so much. I'm delighted to have you both here, to have kind of one perspective from the policy world and one perspective very much from an entrepreneurial space from the private sphere. So I'm hoping to kick it off. We can just kind of set the philosophical stage for our discussion. I'll open it up to both of you, whoever would like to jump in, but maybe you could speak a little bit to kind of the different approaches to value prescriptions in this conversation.
Yeah, so I'll maybe kick it off looking at kind of a broader policy framework. And I think it's really important as we have this conversation and rooted in our forests that we acknowledge that there are both private timberlands and public timberlands, some owned by the federal government. States have timberlands, and then there's private entities as well, and family forests and those sorts of things. So we'll do our best to kind of distinguish between those sectors, because I think there's going to be different values assigned to those different jurisdictions of land ownership. But I think first and foremost, as Carson was acknowledging in his introduction, the way that we value forests is largely related on what do we get out of them. For some people, that is just intrinsic value. The fact that these forests exist and are a beautiful, peaceful space away from other humans and the bustle of life. For other people, it's recreation. Our forests provide huge areas of open space where we can go and hike and bike or fish or whatever that might be. For others, it's really how we have our lives. We rely on forests for so much of our watersheds. Where I'm at in Bozeman, our water comes directly from the nearby national forest. And so the health of that forest ecosystem is really important for the water that we drink and use every single day. For others, like Carson's TimberRise company, like we rely on timber for products. We cut down the trees and we use them to build houses or structures or things that, so again, support our lives. And so the way that we value these resources really depends on how we interact with them and how we and kind of what our benefit is out of those. And there's, as I just described, there's a huge range of that. So Carson, would love to hear your thoughts as well, especially from the private space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a really good point around how forests, probably on a level that's probably not exceeded and probably equal to anything else in the environment, has so many stakeholders that are present, interacting. I mean, you can think about the trout, the salmon, the mountain bikers, the resource extraction, clean drinking water. You brought up a lot of those, and so I think what's really important to talk about is you have those primary users, but then there's downstream users from them as well, and you could think about that in terms of waterways and rivers affecting, in the Pacific Northwest, we have massive, salmon runs that move both from the salt into our forests. And then we also have the need to extract lumber to produce different products that's a downstream effect as well. And so I think that circling back with this whole constellation of stakeholders, it's very important to think about the value that we prescribe to them, and that value can never be equal, because if everyone had equal bearing on the forest, then nothing would ever get done. You have to have a kind of an asymmetry of value allocation in some capacity, and so the process in which you go through that to decide how that value is prescribed, Hannah, to your point, is much different on the public land than it is on the private. Tying things back to kind of my perspective on lumber, it's since the pandemic began, we've seen about 180% increase in lumber prices, and there's a whole host of reasons for them. Everything from hurricanes to a pretty significant fire season last fall, predominantly around Labor Day. COVID-19 shutting down the sawmills and creating this huge lag in the supply side of the equation. People wanting to move out of cities into more rural areas, causing more home construction, tariffs, restaurant patios, home improvement projects. Like, there's a whole host of things. And then at the end of the day, this all drives part of that conversation about forests in particular. So I just I wanted to kind of paint that picture of there's a lot of downstream effects when we're actually looking at forests in particular.
Yeah, and Carson, piggybacking off one of the points you made of how there's all of these stakeholders and how do we weigh and balance those varying needs or interests, I think that's at PERC, as I was saying, our basis is free market environmentalism based in kind of markets and property rights. And that's where I think property rights are so helpful in solving these sorts of problems, because you're able to understand, okay, whoever owns that resource or has the senior property right to it, kind of their opinions or their values of the timber and the forest resource as a whole sort of dictates how that land is subsequently managed or used. But that's where the second part comes in, trade. And that is the way that we're then able to realize other people's competing values, right? And if someone is willing to trade you and you are able to give up some of your right, and then they get to use the product or the timber resource or forest resource, how they so choose, that's where I think for conservation purposes, you're able to get the property right side coupled with the trade. And that's when we're able to actually have natural kind of allocation amongst those competing users, rather than relying on government or sort of one centralized body who lacks a lot of the on the ground knowledge for what's actually going on a piece of land. That's I think where a lot of that comparison between property rights and or government comes in, which isn't to say, you know, all forests should be privatized or anything like that. It's more to say, how can we look at those different structures of allocations and try and bring in some of those market tools or trade tools so that we're able to better allocate and solve some of those knowledge problems that come from centralized control over a public resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think that you know, there's even within private or publicly held, publicly managed forests, you can see the difference in how states manage their forests versus the federal government, because there's a need to have some type of you know, monetary extraction to hit goals, whether it's funding schools or some part of the state level budget. They use those lands and they manage them to their highest value to do that, versus, you know, the federal government, there isn't as clear of a mandate on federally managed lands. And so I think that's really important. That I've heard it described as rivalry in the market, where there's a rivalry of competing uses, and that then drives value and drives kind of the highest and best use for the land. I think one piece of that might come as a rebuttal is that you know, very, call it high value areas of forestry or of the environment that don't have rivalry, like ecological value. Are there solutions that PERC has put forth in order to, call it artificially, or maybe better way to say it is to leverage the free market to create rivalry for those uses?
Yeah, that is spot on. And that is one of the hardest things, especially when we look at a resource like a forest, where traditionally we think of the value as extractive, right? Creating timber to go to houses, pulling the trees out of the forest there. And so part of the question that we've asked is, okay, if there is a benefit to having a healthy forest ecosystem, which can involve active thinning and harvest and ensuring that we have more of a healthy ecosystem-wide approach to things. But one of those benefits, as we talked about earlier, is like healthy water downstream. When you have a healthy forest and the soil is healthy, you aren't getting weird sediment runoff into the rivers. You aren't having huge catastrophic wildfires that subsequently ruin your water quality, those sorts of things. So we've been looking at how can you harness the interest of folks who rely on that water, for example, to be interested and invested in the overall health of the forest. And one tool that's really cool coming out of California, and we hope can be scaled up, it's called a forest resilience bond. And it's this really interesting financial tool. And I can't claim to be the expert in all of the ways that this tool works, but the gist of it is that they have been able to harness folks who benefit from the healthy ecosystem, the healthy water, and a whole range of basic investors that are willing to put forward some of the money up front to come in and do some of this healthy forest restoration work upstream. And they're able to, the exact mechanisms of paying for it and generating a return on investment. Hopefully it comes from the fact that you don't have to worry about paying for rebuilding after a fire in the future. You don't have to spend as much cleaning and purifying your water. And even some of the land managers are paying back into the system too. But it just goes to show that I think there are these really unique mechanisms where people are starting to realize, as you're saying, those secondary values outside of just timber products that come from these forests. And we're seeing ways that the market is sort of naturally coming in to solve some of those problems and promote those healthier ecosystems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would throw recreation as one of those secondary values that are really growing, especially with the last year of people, not wanting to be indoors and not wanting to be in cities. The value for open spaces and wild public lands has probably risen dramatically, in people's minds. Call it the average voter constituent. There's probably more of a premium currently than there was a year ago at this time. And as a quick tangent, I won't get distracted by this, but that's why it was such I would say as a citizen of the United States and of the state of Washington, it was so egregious that the governor shut down access to public lands during the first couple of days of the pandemic. Talking about private property rights, at the end of the day, as citizens, those public lands are part of our individual private property rights within the collective. I don't know if that's the best way to say it, but
no, I totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a huge blow, I think, to people's call it sense of direct ownership over public lands. So
yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge part too. And going back to sort of that previous point I've made on that, when we talk about property rights, it doesn't just necessarily mean we have to privatize everything, right? Like that's kind of the easiest solution per se. But as you're saying, like there are also communal property rights and ways that we as a community or as Americans, US citizens, come together and have ownership over these landscapes. I think what is really important there then is noting we also have to be responsible. Being an owner of something doesn't mean you just say to the federal government, you guys take care of it. You have the Forest Service in Washington, D.C. It's also taking things on ourselves and saying, we don't want to see wildfires happening anymore. We want healthy forests. We want to be able to go out and hike or bike or just sit and read a book and be able to enjoy nature. And so a lot of that has to come back to us, right? And creating some of those more localized solutions where we're able to actually get stuff done on the ground. And us as the users, as the collective owners, are able to step in and take charge of some of those management approaches rather than just hoping that even we've been discussing the differences in forest management between where I'm at in Montana and you guys are in Washington, and understanding that like some of the decisions that might be made by our land managers here don't apply as well to the ecosystems that you guys have there. And so being willing to recognize, yeah, we own these places. That also means we have to understand the local intricacies of them and ensure that we're being proactive and conserving and managing those landscapes. So, but completely agree and love the point you're saying of like, we have ownership over these things. And that's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I liked how you combined ownership and responsibility, because those two go very closely hand in hand. I'd say one example that we talked about earlier that I think is applicable here is, on the west slopes of the Cascades, oftentimes when you're harvesting private or publicly held forest land, there's a need to clear cut that land because, the deciduous trees, so your oaks and your poplars and your maples, et cetera, will pop up quickly. And so you need, if you have shaded environments, you need to clear cut them so sunlight gets in to give those conifers a fighting chance at the resource of the sun, so they can grow in lockstep with the deciduous. And then you go back through and you cut the deciduous out and then let your conifers grow. It's very different than, the east slopes of the Cascades here in Washington or Idaho or Montana, just because the level of precipitation is so high. But what does responsibility look like? Well, if you're cutting along a major arterial, it could be leaving a thin buffer in place to help protect the view corridor and to help have a buffer from people's main driving access. And so that's why it's just it's really important to marry those two together, responsibility and ownership. And that's just one example. I'd say other basic ones is just like leave no trace when you're in public lands, or being really careful with fires. Especially over the last couple of years, we've had such big fires. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I also want to tackle one thing in terms of forest management. I think there's a certain myth around forests where they're gentle and bucolic and not subject to any level of catastrophe or anything like that. Well, no, I mean, they're wild places. So I spent a lot of my childhood over in Eastern Washington, and as a family, we would see, summertime lightning strikes hit forests and start fires, and we would call them in, and, within an hour, a helicopter would be putting out that forest. That was part of my childhood, and that was a given assumption. Was that a good thing? That's been the forest, management policy for decades now. But what that's done is that's built up massive amounts of fuel in our forests, where our forests are designed to burn. And they're designed to burn low, so you burn all that fuel out at the base of the trees, and then you don't create that ladder effect where fire then gets up in the crowns, and then you have catastrophic fires. Well, we've mismanaged our forests for decades, and there's a lot of data around this, and there's a lot of research. So to mitigate that, I think it's really interesting to think about private market solutions and leveraging the free market to now come in and have access to do targeted thinning. So not to clear cut, to take, and I'm talking more in the east slopes, fire prone areas, Montana, Idaho, et cetera, Eastern Oregon. Take every other tree and sustainable harvesting. And then what you can do is you now have a market for it, because we've got a material like mass timber that we use at TimberRise, cross-laminated timber panels that build larger engineered wood panels out of smaller dimensional logs. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example right there of where there's been government mismanagement for decades, and we now have an issue on our doorstep on public lands. And I'm hoping that regulators get out of the way to allow the free market to step in and create a solution. I mean, people in Seattle complain about smoke in August and September, and I'm right there. It was bad this last year. We had some of the worst air quality in the United States. Well, part of that reason is mismanagement of lands. We're having bigger fires because we've built up fuel resources, that are getting up and burning these forests on a scale that historically hasn't been present. So that's another consideration right there of private, in that instance, bailing out the public mismanagement.
Yeah, I think that's totally spot on. And wildfire is, especially here in Montana, and I just think throughout the West, like it is just such a pressing issue. We have seen so many things burn, and as you're mentioning, mismanagement has largely gotten us here. And as you're saying, like there's ways to also have the government get out of the way, acknowledging, these are collectively owned pieces of land. They're owned by all Americans, which I guess once you start dividing amongst hundreds of millions of people, it's a little bit difficult to boil down to exact ownership scale and things there. But your point on how can we have government get out of the way and better partner with private industry is so important. Mm-hmm. Like the creation of these mass timber companies, or using mass timber products, in private companies, like that is so innovative. And those are the sorts of solutions that can help get in and say, okay, we have this mismanagement problem. We don't have some of the huge old growth timbers or big wide trees that we maybe had in the past because we just have overcrowding and some of this mismanagement. But here's a tool and here's an actual valuable product that can go in there and start getting some of this work done. And I think that's where we have to see some of this regulation lifted to allow for better partnerships. Things like allowing allowing longer contracting term lengths between the federal government and private entities so that there's actually time to be able to go in and get some of these projects done. Getting stuff done on the ground takes time. It's a bummer, but that's the way it is. So we need to look beyond like 5-10 years and start looking longer term so that we have surety of, okay, yeah, we have this contract with the Forest Service. We know we can continue to get in there and thin out these thin diameter timbers that are causing all of these problems. And then with that surety of knowing this will go on for long enough, okay, great, then we can have some more timber mills going on. Like, it's worth it to invest in this sort of infrastructure. Right now, with just so much unsurety, it's really difficult to justify privately investing dollars in getting stuff done when the public federal government isn't really being a good long-term partner.
Yeah, those are really good points right there. And there's so many different tangents that I would want to go off on.
Exactly.
That's a lot of fun. I think that one of the your really good points was about longer term contracts. And I'm not a logger, but I interact with them quite a bit and hear about the need for, when competing for contracts with the Forest Service or state managed agencies, the need for long-term predictability, because the cost of environmental review, the cost of putting in road infrastructure to support logging is so high that you need to have a runway moving forward. So positioning these public entities as good partners is a really good way to put that. Just, at the end of the day, the forest is going to win. That's the goal through these targeted thinning processes. So.
And a point too, looking at long-term contracts, whether that's on public lands or especially on private lands, right? You own it into perpetuity unless you choose to sell or otherwise. Like, a forest they're sustainable, right? You can regrow trees, and that's a beautiful, amazing thing. And so if you know that the product that you want to sell or develop or whatever that might be relies on the sustainability and your continued health of the forest as a whole, you aren't going to want to do something to destroy that ecosystem. You're going to want to, yes, harvest and thin sustainably while being very conscious of the fact that what you do today impacts your ability to use tomorrow. And that is where I think some of these property rights, again, be it totally private or contracted or whatever that might be, that's where it comes in so handy in looking to the overall conservation of these landscapes and understanding that what you put in or what you take out today impacts what you can do tomorrow. So if you also want to get stuff out of it tomorrow, you better care about what you do today. And I kind of love that cycle because I think it just so perfectly showcases why we should care about lengths, why we should care about private partners, those sorts of things. Because we're creating products and extracting something from the forest, but when done responsibly, it can be such a useful tool in providing those secondary values that we've talked about. Good recreation, reduced wildfire risk, healthy watersheds. It can all come together if we do it right. Yeah,
definitely. And when I hear you describe that, the word that pops to mind is resilience, and resilience within systems. And I think that one of the biggest factors to having resilience in systems is accountability. And so having dynamics where you have checks and balances in a system really supports long-term viability. And so having a system where you view forests as a renewable resource in a big way. And don't get me wrong, here in the Northwest, we still have some stands of old growth forests. Those should be protected. They're unique, they're rare, they're stunning, they're a treasure. But what I'm talking about is totally different. I'm talking about forests that are being managed for the yield, for the cuts, where you have targeted cuts at 30, 40 years. And what you're doing there from a carbon sequestration standpoint too is you are allowing trees to grow during their biggest, their steepest growing curve, where they capture the most amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. You're then harvesting those trees. You're locking those trees into what's referred to as a carbon sink. So if you're framing a single family home, or if you're creating mass timber panels to build an 18-story office building in New York City. It doesn't matter. You're capturing that carbon for the life of those structures, but then you're also freeing up space for new trees to be planted, and then to keep this resilient cycle that you were describing going. And we need more of that. I mean, the projections for population growth, over the next 10 years are stunning. And so thinking about where those people are going to live, and then how are we going to house them, and what type of materials we're going to use, and how wild places in nature are going to be a partner with us in that. You have to have a resilient system to support that type of growth. So
definitely. And your point on trees as carbon sequesterers is really, really strong. And it gets back to there's so often like debate and discussion over our forest ecosystems actually carbon sinks, or how long does carbon have to be sequestered for it to actually become a carbon sink, those sorts of things. But ultimately, so much of it comes down to, well, like one, wildfires emit a huge amount of carbon. And so having a situation that just burns up all of our trees doesn't seem like a viable solution when we're concerned about carbon emissions. But also looking at the cycling, the resilience there, the restoration of being able to develop a healthier ecosystem. That's when then we're able to see a lot of these benefits. It's not just a one and done type thing. It's, as you're describing, we're able to use these products instead of more fossil fuel intensive alternatives like steel. And then we're able to replant and continue to have that growth, continue to have that sequestration. It's probably not going to solve everything, right? But this can be a part of the puzzle that we address. But ultimately, it comes down to how we manage it, and how we go about doing it really matters if we want those positive outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. And but I don't, at the same time, I definitely can't downplay how complicated these forests are amongst the stakeholders. And I was just reading about a state forest in Oregon. I was reading this last week. So around Labor Day of this past year, about 3,000 acres. I think there was like 1 million acres that burned in total. I don't know the quite number, but this was just 3,000 in particular on state land. And it's all standing dead. It's charred black forest at this point, and there's still value in those logs for a short period of time before they start to decay, where they can be harvested and then milled into lumber. So the Oregon State Department of Forestry was planning to move forward with a harvest, because at the end of the day, when those logs start to break down and fall over, they will emit carbon up in the atmosphere. And so there's a window of time to capture all that carbon and put it into built structures. But right before logging is supposed to start, or the plans are being laid, 7 environmental groups sued the state, and their reasons and their rationale is drinking water, recreation, and forest health. So being able to get people into one cohesive plan is quite difficult, but I think it comes back to the value conversation, because at the end of the day, I would imagine those environmental groups don't want to do anything that supports more carbon in the atmosphere. I would put a large wager that they would not support more carbon in the atmosphere.
I bet you're right.
but they're in their lawsuit, they're supporting recreation, drinking water, and forest health as their rationale. So there's those conversations are difficult to be had, and I think that there's always going to be some measure of dissent in them.
And I think that might be one of the key takeaways from this conversation, whether people decide that they suddenly want to go out and get super interested in one really intricate element of forest management or timber products or whatever it is, but to understand exactly those value trade-offs, but to understand that so often these things go hand in hand. It's not necessarily a one size fits all solution. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of interconnectedness. And so I would just encourage folks to think carefully about these issues. We're about to enter wildfire season. There's going to be a lot of headlines out there. And so to just think, what are some of these values? How do these values compete with each other or benefit each other? And think through more of the systems there, and think through how can we maybe come together and collaborate on some of those shared objectives rather than immediately react to catastrophic headlines.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm going to jump back in. Hannah, Carson, thank you so much for such a fantastic discussion. It's been an absolute pleasure to just listen to you both, discuss these issues, talk about forests and free market environmentalism and all the nuances therein, and to hear each of your perspectives kind of play off of each other, complement each other. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Very grateful to have you. Please, I encourage you to share this around if it resonates with you. And definitely check out the Washington Policy Center Young Professionals on our social media platforms, especially Instagram at WPC_Young Professionals. So again, thank you to our listeners. Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Hannah. I'm Marissa Gaston. I'm the YP Director, and we hope to see you again next month. Thank you.